at his wedding. My son stood up and said, "I've always hated our last name. I'm ashamed to be her son." The room laughed while he humiliated me, but he didn't know that name came from millionaires. That same week, I inherited $15 million. I'm Marjorie Hayes, a 68-year-old widow, the owner of Hayes Bakery in Cleveland, Ohio. I had never been to a place like the Boston Country Club before. The air itself seemed to carry a scent of old money cigars, perfume, and power passed down through generations. The lawn stretched out in endless green waves, the kind of perfect symmetry that came not from nature, but from gardeners, paid to make it look effortless. I stepped out of the cab in my best dress, a hand-tailored navy blue I had sewn years ago for church events and funerals, and for the first time in a long while, I felt small. My silver hair was tied neatly in a bun, pinned with the same clip I'd worn at Easton's graduation. Around me, the women floated by in silk and champagne tones, laughing softly as if the world itself would hush to listen. Inside the ballroom, everything glowed. Gold chandeliers, polished marble, the low hum of a string quartet. The Davenport crest was carved into the mahogany walls, and the waiters moved like clockwork in black and white. I stood near the entrance for a moment, clutching the heavy platter in my hands. On it lay a batch of Richard's Memorial cookies, our bakery's most loved recipe, named after my late husband. I had baked them the night before, wrapped each one carefully, and arranged them on the old silver platter that had belonged to my mother-in-law. It was my wedding gift, simple but meaningful, a piece of our history offered to the new family Meissen had chosen. Mom Easton's voice cut through the noise. He looked handsome, almost unrecognizable in his tailored tuxedo. He kissed my cheek quickly, as if embarrassed by the gesture. "You made it great." His hand was already half raised to wave at someone behind me. "This is Amelia's father, Charles Davenport," he said, pulling me toward Atoll Man with a politician's smile. "Dad, sorry, Mr. Davenport, this is my mother." Marjorie Charles Davenport extended a smooth, cool hand. "So nice to meet you, Mrs. Hayes. I've heard you run a bakery. Is it?" His tone hovered between polite interest and mild surprise, like someone learning a rare species still existed. "Yes," I said with a smile. "Hayes Bakery, 40 years old this summer." "Remarkable," he replied, though his eyes were already drifting past me. Amelia appeared beside him, glowing in her ivory gown. She was stunning, poised, flawless, and distant. "Mrs. Hayes," she said smoothly, taking the platter. "Oh, how lovely! Homemade!" She turned to a passing caterer. "Would you please find a place for these?" The caterer hesitated, unsure what to do with something that hadn't come from a 5-star kitchen. He nodded awkwardly and disappeared through the side door. I stood there, my hands empty now, my purpose gone. Easton was already gone too, laughing with Amelia's friends near the bar. I watched him move through the crowd, confident and charming, speaking with the ease of someone who believed he finally belonged. Later, as I stood near a table lined with champagne glasses, I heard his voice again. He was talking to an older man with silver hair and an expensive watch. "So Easton?" the man said. "Your mother still works, right? What does she do?" Easton laughed, the sound sharp and careless. "Oh, she's retired. She used to manage a few retail franchises." The lie sliced through me. "Clean and quiet." He couldn't even say the word baker. The man nodded approvingly, and they clinked glasses. I turned away before Easton could see my face. I told myself to breathe, to remember the smell of yeast and sugar back home, the comfort of the oven's steady hum. That was my world. This one was his. Dinner passed in a blur of fine china and empty conversation. When the music softened, the lights dimmed, and Easton rose to give his groom's speech, I felt my heart beat faster. He looked confident, his champagne glass raised, his smile bright enough to blind. "I want to thank the Davenports," he began, his voice loud over the hush of the room, for welcoming me into their incredible family. He paused, glancing toward Amelia, who smiled like a porcelain doll. "And to my beautiful wife, who has made me the luckiest man alive." Polite applause rippled through the crowd. Then his gaze shifted, finding me in the far corner, sitting with distant cousins no one had bothered to greet. And he said after a pause, "A special thanks to my mother for coming all the way from Cleveland. She taught me the value of hard work." The hesitation was long enough for the room to feel it. His grin flickered. "But today, joining the Davenport family, I feel like I can finally start fresh." The room went utterly still. His voice wavered, then hardened. "Honestly," he said louder now, the alcohol loosening his tongue, "I've always hated our last name. I'm ashamed to be her son." The sound seemed to echo against the high ceiling. The string quartet stopped. Glasses froze halfway to lips. Someone coughed. Then a few of his friends, too drunk to sense the horror, laughed and clapped. Amelia's mother looked away, her mouth tight with disapproval, not at them. But at the scene, I did not move. I set my fork down on the edge of the dessert plate. My hands were steady. I looked straight at my son, and he looked anywhere but back at me. The silence stretched thick and heavy. I could feel every pair of eyes darting between us, waiting for a reaction. There was none, only the faint hum of the air conditioning and the clatter of someone dropping a spoon. Inside me, something quiet and solid locked into place. I memorized the color of the lights, the pattern on the carpet, the way his voice trembled at the end. This was the moment I would not forget. When the music resumed, I rose, walked out of the ballroom, and found the cool night air waiting beyond the doors. I didn't say goodbye. By dawn, I was sitting in a small seat by the airplane window, watching the clouds drift beneath me. My son was sleeping somewhere below, wrapped in silk sheets and his new name, and I, Marjorie Hayes of Cleveland, baker, widow. Mother was flying home, carrying nothing but silence and the memory of what he had said. Silence became my closest companion. In the weeks after the wedding, the bakery filled it in its own way. The low hum of the ovens, the hiss of steam, the rhythm of kneading dough before dawn. I went back to arriving at 4 a.m. Just like always, there was comfort in repetition, in the scent of yeast and cinnamon rising through the air. In knowing that while the world could shift and betray you, flour and heat would always tell the truth. A week after I returned, Easton sent a text. It appeared on my phone while I was tallying receipts at the front counter. Wedding was stressful. You know how it is. That was all. No apology, no mention of the words he had thrown like knives in front of a ballroom full of strangers. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then I deleted it. The phone screen went black, and with it whatever hope I still had for reconciliation. Time blurred. The mornings were colder now, and I found myself watching the sunrise through the bakery window more often, letting the orange light spill over the flour-dusted counters. Then one afternoon a cuisinier arrived. He was young, wearing a gray uniform, holding a thick cream-colored envelope embossed with a gold seal. For Mrs. Marjorie Hayes, he said the return address read Feldman Royce and Associates, San Jose, California. I frowned. I didn't know anyone in California. Inside was a letter formal, measured, the kind written by people who never used contractions. It informed me that my late uncle-in-law, Theodore Hayes, had passed away. Theodore, the family's ghost, my father-in-law's brother, the eccentric, who'd fled to California decades ago. Everyone had said he'd burned through his savings chasing dreams. I almost set the letter aside, thinking it was just a formality, but then I read the next paragraph. Theodore, it seemed, had not been a failure at all. He had been one of those quiet early investors in something called personal computing. He'd lived modestly in a small house in Palo Alto, but he had held shares, founding shares in several technology companies that were now household names. By the time of his death, his estate was valued at over $15 million. And I, Marjorie Hayes, the baker of Cleveland, Ohio, was his sole heir. My hands went cold as I read the words. There was a clause in the will, one that made me stop breathing for a moment. It said, "To the last hire who still takes pride in honest labor and is not ashamed of their roots." I sat at my kitchen table. The letter spread before me, the ticking of the wall clock suddenly loud. For a long while, I couldn't move. The words seemed to glow from the page, sharp and personal, as if he'd known everything that had happened. I thought of the wedding, of Easton's flushed face, and the sting of his voice when he said he was ashamed of me. I closed my eyes and whispered aloud, "You never even met him. Theo, how could you know?" There was a second envelope inside, handwritten. The paper faintly yellowed. It was from Theodore himself. His writing was careful, deliberate. "If you are reading this, I am gone," it began. "And I imagine you're wondering why I kept track of the family from afar. I knew of Richard's passing. He knew of your bakery for years. I ordered your pastries through a proxy company under a different name. You never cut corners. In a world of fakes and shortcuts, you kept the recipe honest. You honored the Hayes name. Every morning you turned on that oven. This is not a gift. It is a responsibility." By the time I finished, tears had blurred the ink. Not grief exactly, something deeper, heavier. Gratitude, yes, but also the weight of being seen. After so long, feeling invisible. That night I didn't sleep. I sat at my kitchen table until the first light crept through the curtains. When the phone finally rang the next morning, it was a lawyer from California confirming the transfer of assets. His tone was smooth, practiced, detached. "Congratulations, Mrs. Hayes," he said. "You're a very wealthy woman, but I didn't feel wealthy." I felt accountable. In the days that followed, I went to the bakery as usual. I still wore the same apron, still drove the same rusting sedan, still turned the key in the same door at 4 in the morning. I didn't tell anyone, not even the staff who had been with me for years. Money had destroyed too many people I knew. It wouldn't touch me that way. Instead, I made an appointment with my lawyer, Mr. Carter, a quiet man who'd handled my husband's estate years ago. I told him I wanted to set up a foundation, something that would outlive me. "Name it after Richard," I said. "The Richard Hayes Scholarship Fund." He looked up from his notepad. "Purposeful scholarships," I said, "for working-class kids from Ohio who want to study law or finance. The kind of kids who feel they don't belong in rooms like my son does." He nodded slowly. "Anonymous or public anonymous?" I said, "Let the good speak for itself." When I left his office, their outside felt different, lighter somehow. I didn't have revenge in my heart. Not yet, just clarity. Theodore had left me more than money. He'd left me the means to turn shame into strength. And as I walked back to my car, the scent of flour still on my skin, I whispered a quiet promise to myself. If my son was ashamed of the Hayes name, I would make sure the world never was. 8 months passed, and I heard nothing from Easton. Not a call, not a letter, not even a postcard from the glossy life he had chosen in Boston. But every so often I saw a glimpse of that life in the society pages. His name printed beneath photos of gala dinners and charity auctions. He looked like he belonged there in his tuxedo beside Amelia's polished smile. And maybe for a while he did. They had bought a penthouse overlooking the Charles River, a place that gleamed like glass in every sense. Beautiful, fragile, and entirely unsustainable. While I spent my mornings rolling dough, my son spent his chasing the illusion of importance. I didn't know that then, not until later, when the first cracks began to show. Easton's firm managed money for the kind of people who never worried about rent families, like the Davenports, whose wealth had grown roots over generations. But Easton was not content with being an employee. He wanted to impress, to prove that marrying into their world wasn't a fluke. So he took a risk, a massive unauthorized trade, a gamble on a volatile market he barely understood. When the numbers turned against him, they didn't just fall, they imploded overnight. He lost millions, money that wasn't his, money that included part of a Davenport family trust. By the time the firm realized what he had done, the damage was irreversible. Quiet meetings were held behind closed doors. His name was whispered in boardrooms with words like liability and termination. Lawsuits loomed like thunderclouds in Cleveland. I was unaware of all this. My days were still anchored by the same rhythms. The hum of mixers, the creak of the front door, the chatter of regular customers. But that week, something extraordinary happened. The Cleveland Plain Dealer ran a front-page story. The Secret Angel of Ohio, anonymous donor changes hundreds of lives. They had traced the scholarship fund's impact, the students who'd gone to law school, the families whose children had their first chance at college. No one knew the benefactor's name, and I intended to keep it that way. That evening, after closing the bakery, I sat by the window and read the article twice. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride exactly, but peace. Somewhere in the distance, my husband would have been smiling. 2 days later, my phone buzzed with a message from an unfamiliar number. The area code was Boston. It was a screenshot of that same article sent by Amelia. Look, someone from your hometown is doing good. Wish we knew them. We could probably use a loan right about now, LOL. I stared at the screen, the irony pressing down on me like weight. My hands trembled slightly as he set the phone aside. The air in the bakery felt heavier than usual, thick with the scent of sugar and heat. I knew then that trouble was coming. The call came that evening. The number flashed across the phone, and for a moment I didn't recognize it. When I picked up, there was nothing. Just breathing, unsteady, shallow. Mom, I froze. I hadn't heard his voice in nearly a year. It was raw, stripped of that affected Boston confidence. He sounded young again, frightened. Eastston, I said softly. What's happened? He didn't waste time. I'm in trouble. Big trouble. I can't explain everything, but I need money. 100,000. It's not a favor. It's not a request. I just need it. If I don't get it, I'm finished. His words hit like cold water. I leaned against the counter, staring at the dough rising in the oven's glow. Eastston, I said slowly. I don't have that kind of money. The bakery just replaced the main oven. Business has been slow. There was silence, then a sharp intake of breath. Don't do this, Mom, he said, voice rising. You don't understand. This isn't about money. It's my career, my life. Just sell the bakery. It's not worth anything anyway. I could hear the panic under the anger. The same desperation I'd once seen in him as a child when he broke something and didn't know how to fix it. But there was something else now, a cruelty that hadn't been there before. I straightened, my hand still resting on the steel counter. Easton, I said quietly, you made your choices. You told the world you were ashamed of the Hayanami. You made it clear what you thought of me and of this bakery. Mom, this isn't about that, he said, his voice breaking. Please, I'm afraid it is. Interrupted. My tone was steady, almost calm. That shameful name in this damn bakery can't save you now. You wanted a fresh start. Remember, you got it. Don't call me for money again, Mom. Wait, but I had already pulled the phone from Mir. The last thing I heard was the sharp crack of his breath, half a sob, half a curse before the line went dead. For a long while I stood in the silence of the bakery. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly above me. The dough timer went off, steady and indifferent. I turned back to my work, wiping down the counter slowly, one clean stroke after another, until the steel shone. There were no tears this time, only the quiet knowledge that something had broken between us, and it might never be repaired. Outside, the snow began to fall in soft, silent flakes against the dark windows, and I thought to myself, sometimes love isn't about giving what's asked, it's about refusing what shouldn't be given. The news of Eastston's downfall reached me the way storms arrive in the Midwest, quiet at first. Then all at once the scandal didn't make national headlines. But in Boston's financial world, it spread like wildfire. Clients whispered. Former colleagues avoided his name. The firm dismissed him discreetly, protecting its reputation. The Davenports, careful to keep their dynasty spotless, moved quickly. Amelia was advised to separate herself from the damage. Within weeks, Eastston's penthouse was sold, his car repossessed, his reputation quietly buried beneath a pile of non-disclosure agreements. By the time he arrived at the bakery, winter had settled over Cleveland like a heavy quilt. I had just finished closing for the night when I heard the bell above the door. I turned, expecting a late customer. Instead, my son stood there thin, unshaven, his expensive coat hanging off him like an afterthought. His eyes were hollow. He smelled faintly of cold coffee and desperation. For a moment neither of us spoke. The snow from his shoes melted onto the tile, pooling in small circles around his feet. Finally, he said my name, the way a lost child says home, Mom. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice steady. Eastston. He swallowed hard. I was wrong about everything. His voice broke. I have nowhere else to go. I studied him for a long moment. The man who had once stood in front of hundreds of strangers and said he was ashamed Toby, my son. The lines of arrogance that used to shape his face were gone, replaced by exhaustion. Whatever pride he'd carried had already been stripped away. Your old room's upstairs, I said finally. But you'll earn your keep. He nodded, relief and shame flickering across his face. I will, I promise. That night, I listened to the floorboard squeak above me, to the restless shifting of someone who no longer knew where he belonged. The next morning, he was downstairs before I was. He didn't ask what to do. He just started working. I watched him from behind the counter, still in his wrinkled shirt, hauling 50 lb bags of flour, his hands red and raw from scrubbing the delivery van. He didn't complain. He didn't speak much either. Days turned into weeks, and Thessalon's between us softened into something fragile but bearable. He was no longer the man who walked with polished shoes and a tailored suit. He was a man learning again how to stand on solid ground. Each morning at 3, he'd meet me by the ovens, his hair tousled, his eyes heavy with sleep. I'd hand him the list for deliveries, and he'd nod without a word. Slowly, the smell of yeast began to cling to him again, just as it once had to his father. One afternoon, as we were stacking trays of bread to cool, I said, "The Richard Hayes Fund is having its annual gala next week. They invited me as a local business owner." He wiped sweat from his brow and glanced at me. "The scholarship thing? I've heard people talk about it." I nodded. "Yes, I want you to come with me. Wear your last good suit." He hesitated, searching my face. "You sure I am?" The following Saturday, we drove to the Cleveland Museum of Art. The night was clear, the marble steps gleaming beneath soft, white lights. Inside, the air buzzed with conversation and the clinking of champagne glasses. The city's mayor was there, local politicians, business leaders, all dressed in their finest. I saw Eastston stiffened beside him, tugging at the collar of his suit that no longer fit quite right. When the music faded and the speeches began, I noticed him shrinking into his chair the way a guilty man does when the world seems too bright. The fund's CEO, a tall woman in a black gown, took the stage, her voice carried easily across the hall. "And tonight," she said, smiling toward the crowd, "our anonymous benefactor, the heart and soul of this foundation, has decided to step into the light for the very first time." Applause rippled through the room. I felt Easton shift beside me, curiosity in his expression. "Please welcome," the woman continued, "Mrs. Marjorie Hayes of Hayes Bakery." The air left his body. I heard it a sharp, quiet exhale that sounded almost like pain. His head turned toward me slowly, disbelief etched across every feature. His lips parted, but no words came. I rose, smoothing my dress, and walked toward the stage as the audience stood in thunderous applause. The lights were bright, the air thick. I looked out over the crowd, faces I didn't know, some beaming, others curious, and found Eastston's pale and still at the far end of the table. I began simply. I never expected to be standing here. I'm not a politician or a businesswoman. I'm a baker. I started Hayes Bakery with my husband Richard 40 years ago. He believed that education could change the course of a life. When my late uncle-in-law, Theodore Hayes, passed away, he left behind a fortune. $15 million he had quietly built as an investor in Silicon Valley. His will said the money should go to the last Hayes heir, who still takes pride in honest work. There were murmurs in the audience. I took a breath and continued. I created this fund not for recognition, but because I believe the measure of a person isn't their wealth, it's what they do with it. I've learned that great fortune isn't a blessing. It's a test of character. My AS found Easton's again. His face was drained of color, his fingers gripping the edge of the table. "I have a son," I said at his wedding. He told me he was ashamed of the Hayes name. The room went silent. Not a whisper, not a cough. Just the stillness of truth laid bare. Easton pushed back his chair. The screech of wood against marble echoed like a gunshot. He stood abruptly, his jaw tight, his eyes glossy with humiliation. He turned and began walking toward the exit, his shoulders rigid. I paused. My heart beat steady but heavy. Then I said his name, Easton. My voice carried clearly through the microphone. Calm but firm. He stopped at the doorway. The whole room waited. If you ever decide to earn the name Hayes again, I said, the bakery door opens at 4 a.m. He stood there for a long second, shoulders slumped, then left without looking back. Silence held the room like breath. Then one by one people began to stand, first in hesitation. Then in full applause, the sound rose, filling the vast hall. But I didn't smile. My hands gripped the sides of the podium, the wood pressing into my palms. I wasn't proud. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply tired. Tired of pain disguised as love, of lessons learned too late, of the weight that came with both pride and forgiveness. As the applause washed over me, I lowered my gaze and whispered under my breath, unheard by anyone but myself, "Please let him come home." Easton didn't come home that night. When the gala ended and the applause faded, I drove back alone through the quiet streets of Cleveland. The bakery was dark when I arrived, its familiar windows reflecting nothing but my headlights. I sat on the stool by the front window and stared at the empty street outside. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the room. My hands were still trembling from the speech. I kept asking myself if I had gone too far, if those words, sharp and honest as they were, had cut deeper than I ever intended. Maybe I had lost him for good. Maybe this time the door I'd left open would stay that way, open, but empty. 3 days passed in silence. I moved through my mornings like a machine. Unlock the door at 4, switch on the lights, measure the flour, check the ovens. My body remembered what to do, even if my mind didn't. Each morning, I checked my phone before sunrise, half expecting a message, a call, a sign of life. There was nothing, not even a single word. By the end of the week, I stopped checking. Some wounds, I reminded myself, don't heal through apologies. They heal through time and work. It was 1 week to the day after the gala when it happened. The sky was ink black, the air sharp with February cold. As I pulled into the alley behind the bakery, my headlights caught something on the front step. A shadow hunched low beside the milk crates. I killed the engine and sat for a moment, my heart pounding. Then I saw him, Easton. He was curled against the door, wearing a threadbare coat, his head resting on his knees. Frost clung to his hair. The sight of him so small, so still, hit me harder than anything he'd ever said. I opened the car door, the jingle of my keys breaking the silence. His eyes blinked open, unfocused at first, then wide with recognition, he scrambled to his feet. Stiff, unsteady. "Mom," he said, his voice raw and cracked from the cold. I'm here for work." I stood a few feet away, studying him under the dim glow of the streetlight. His face was leaner now, stripped of pride, and his lips were chapped. There was no trace of Boston in his voice anymore, just the boy I used to know. For a long moment, I said nothing. Then I gave a small nod and turned toward the door. "You're 2 minutes late," I said, fitting the key into the lock. "The yeast doesn't wait." The faintest smile ghosted across his face. "Yes, ma'am." We went inside. The warmth of the ovens wrapped around us, chasing the chill from the air. For the first time in years, the silence between us didn't hurt. It felt like the start of something fragile and real. 6 months later, we found our rhythm again. Easton stayed in Cleveland. Amelia filed for divorce quietly, and the lawyers stopped calling. He never asked about the fund or the inheritance, and he never offered. He was simply my apprentice. Nothing more, nothing less. Every morning at 4:30, the lights flickered on and the bakery came alive. The scent of yeast filled the air, the same as it always had. One morning, as I wrestled with a large batch of sourdough, my hands refused to cooperate. The arthritis had grown worse. The ache in my fingers felt like fire. Your hands, Mom? Easton said softly, stepping forward. The arthritis is bad. Let me, he took the dough from. His hands, once soft from keyboards and cufflinks, were now calloused and strong. Dusted with flour, he began to knead. Steady and sure, pressing and folding with a rhythm that mirrored mine from years ago. I watched him for a long moment, the corners of my mouth softening despite myself. Good, I said quietly. A little more flour, son. He smiled faintly and reached for the bag beside him. Outside, the first light of dawn spilled across the window, turning the flour in the air to gold. And as I stood there watching him work, I realized that the true inheritance had never been the money or the scholarship or even the name. It was this, hands in the dough, heart steady, the quiet rhythm of creation before the world wakes up. The bakery at dawn, the legacy of a name finally earned. Thank you for listening to this story from Grandma Stories. Marguerite Hayes went through heartbreak, betrayal, and loss before rediscovering what truly matters: honor, work, and forgiveness. Her journey reminds us that real inheritance isn't money, but the values we pass on. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, subscribe, and explore more of our most powerful grandma revenge stories on our page. Don't forget to leave a comment with your thoughts or similar stories you've experienced. We'd love to hear from